Hello everyone, and welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, we'll be exploring how to pass data between components using output properties. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we want to update our app.component.ts file, the assignment variable, to exercise 6.2 input-output properties part 1. Next, we're going to want to generate two new components. So we're going to generate a wish list component and then a wish list create component. Okay, we're also going to want to create a new interface. So I'll go ahead and close out the terminal window. And then you just want to, inside the app root directory, want to go ahead and click a new file. And then we're just going to name this interface wishlistitem.interface.ts. And then we're going to name this interface iWishListItem. This interface is going to have two fields, one for title and one for authors. Title will be of a string type, and then authors is going to be of a string type. Okay, once I'm done with that, we're going to go ahead and open up the app.module.ts file, and we're going to import over our mat form field module, the mat input module, and the forms module. And as you learned from previous exercises, whatever we add to our import statements, we need to add it to our imports array. So I'm just going to add those now. Okay, we're also going to need to add routing for our wish list item, our wish list component that we just created. So let's go ahead and open up our app-routing.module.ts file, and then we just want to add a new entry for the wish list component. So before I add it, I'm actually going to import it in through our imports query. So we're going to say import wish list component. And then for the route, we're just going to say wish list. So path will be wish list. And then the component we're going to map to is going to be the wish list component. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. So the next thing we want to do now is go ahead and start building out our wish list create component, which is going to be the form that when we submit an item, we want it to populate inside of our wish list component. So I'm going to go ahead and close in all the tabs we have in Visual Studio Code, and then we're going to open up the wish list create component. And we'll start with opening up the component.ts file. Inside the component.ts file, we want to add an import statement for the iWishListItem. In the body of our component, we also want to create an output property, and then we're just going to call that one add item emitter, and then it's going to be a new event emitter. And then get the event emitter, we're going to need to import that over. So inside of our component, and so at the first line, the component on initialization and output, we can just add another entry for our event emitter. Underneath that, we want to add a field for item. So we're going to say item, and this is going to be of type iWishList item. In the constructor of our component, we're going to want to instantiate a new iWishList item and set it to the type of this.item. So we're going to say this.item equals, we're going to have our object literal, and then we're just going to say as iWishList item. And basically what we're doing here is we're essentially casting this object literal to the object type iWishList item. We're also going to want to add a new function, and this function is going to be called addItem, so that every time that a user actually tries to add a wish list item, we're going to call this function, and those items are going to be emitted to the wish list component. And so inside the body of the addItem, we're just going to say this dot add item emitter. And then we're going to say dot emit. So we're going to emit the values that are entered in by the user. And those are going to be the title. And it's also going to be the authors. Once we've emitted the item values, then all we want to do is we just want to reset the this.item to a new empty object literal. All right, with our TypeScript code completed, let's go ahead and open up the HTML file and we'll start building out our form for the submission and to be able to emit those items to the wish list component. So we're going to open up the wishlist create.component.html file. We can go ahead and remove the pre-generated code. And now this time we actually want to create a form. So we're going to say form, and this is going to be an FX layout of column. And then we're going to give it a class of wishlist create form. Inside this form, we're going to have two form fields. We're going to have a mat form field for the title, and then we're going to have a mat form field for the authors. And then we'll have one button to submit the form when a user is finished filling out the form. We'll give it a mat label. Now, what we also want to do is we want to add this as an ng model. So we're going to have an opening closing bracket, and inside the opening closing bracket, we're going to have a parentheses. And that's basically going to be how we tell the Angular CLI that this field is going to be an ng model field. And we need that so that when we call our event, so the add item event, we can actually capture the values from the form. So we'll need to create that second form field, and again, that one's going to be for the authors. And again, same thing. This is going to be an ng model. So we'll say ng model. And then this one is going to be for the item.authors. And then the last thing we need is we just need a button to handle the form submission. So we're going to say button, and then this is going to be a matte button. We'll give it a color primary. And then we want to create a click event. So we're going to say open and closing parentheses, and then we'll pass in click, and that's going to equal to our add item event that we created in the TypeScript code. And as far as the title goes, we're just going to say add item. And then we can go ahead and save it. With that in place, we can go ahead and move over to our wish list component and then actually add this component to the wish list component and then handle the emission. So when a user enters the items and it gets emitted, we want to be able to handle it and display that in the wish list component. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the wish list component, and specifically we want to open up the component.ts file. And then inside this file is where we'll write all of our TypeScript or business logic to handle the form submission. I always like to close out the other tab just so that it's easier to see and that I don't get confused on which component I'm working with. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and import over the iWishListItem interface. And then I want to create a form field inside the component, and that's going to be items. This is the name of the field, and it's going to be an array of iWishList items. So I'm going to say items, and then the data type is going to be array. And then again, it's going to be of the iWishList item. And then we're going to set it as an empty array. So then I also want to create a function inside the component, and that function is going to be called update item handler. So we're going to say update items handler. It's going to take in an item of the iWishList item type. In the body of this function, we actually want to go ahead and add that item to our array of items that we have on line 11. So our handler is essentially going to take in a new wish list item, and it's going to push that object to the items array. So we're just going to say this.items.push, and then we're going to pass in the item that we just called from this function. Okay, once we're done with that, we can go ahead and open up the HTML code and start implementing the logic that's going to handle all of this form submissions for us. So the first thing we want to do is we'll go ahead and remove the pre-generated code. We want to create a new layout, so we're going to say fx layout column. Then we want to call our wish list create component that we used. So we're going to say app-wishlist create. Now inside this component, we actually want to take the value that a user submits and we want to pass it to our wish list component. So to do that, we need to call the add item emitter. So we're going to say fx flex, and then we're going to have an open and closing parentheses, and this is where we're going to call that add item emitter. And then we're going to say equals to. So once we call that add item emitter, then what do we do with it? So we want to call the update items handler method that we just created. So we're going to say update items handler, and then we're going to pass in the actual event. So we're going to say $event. Underneath that, I'm going to add a couple line spaces just so that the wish list create form there's a couple spaces before the actual printout of the items that we're creating inside the wish list. So then I'm going to have another div. And for this, I'm going to use a mat list. So I'm going to say mat list, and then we'll use a flex, so fx flex, and then we're going to have an ngIf directive. So we're going to say ngIf, and then items, and items.length is greater than 0. So if there's actually an array of items and the length is greater than 0, then let's go ahead and output the results. So we'll say mat list item, and this is going to be for the title. And we're going to say item.title. Then we'll have another mat list. And this is going to be for authors. Now, one thing you'll notice too is that we actually need to iterate over this array. So what we want to do above this is we're going to say mat list item, and then we're going to do an ng4, and we're going to say let item of items so that we can actually get through this list of items that we've been pushing. And then inside this, we're actually going to have divs, and we're going to say mat line. And so we can take the code from our mat list item, and we can just copy and paste that inside this div. And then we'll do the same thing underneath it for the authors. And basically what we want to do is as we loop over this, we want each of these items to be inside one mat list item, but as separate lines. So I'm just going to cut it and then paste it inside there. And then once you do that, you can go ahead and remove the 2 mat list items. Once we have that, we're going to go ahead and just add a little message. And so what's going to happen if if there's no items inside the array, then we want to show to the user a message that basically just says that your wish list is empty. So we're going to say div fx flex, and then we're just going to say ng if it doesn't equal items. So in other words, there's no items, or the items.length equals 0. And then we want to show an h2, and that h2 is just going to say your wish list is empty. So I'm going to say text align center. And then again, we're just going to say your wish list is empty. So all we want to do is go ahead and save this. And then we want to open up a new terminal window. And we're going to go ahead and run this application and see the results of what we've done. So I'm just going to make this a little bit larger. And then we're just going to say ng serve. Okay, it looks like it was successful and there are no errors. So let's go and open up a browser window and we'll navigate to localhost 4200. And we're just going to hit refresh on the screen. Now, if you notice, if you've been following along, there isn't a navigation link in the home component for that, so we're going to need to add that now. So let's go back over to our HTML code, and we actually want to open up our app component.html file, and this is where we're going to add the additional link for the wish list. So we're just going to add a button. We'll give it a router link, and then we want to point to /wishlist, and then we're just going to say wish list. We'll save it, and then let's go back over to our browser window, and we should see a link for the wish list now. And it looks like we do. We have right next to the book list, we have this one called wish list. So let's go ahead and select it. And as you can see, we have a form here with the title and authors, and then we have a section down below that says your wish list is empty. One thing you will notice is that it looks like our form is really large. So let's go ahead and change the size of that so it's not so large across the screen. So let's go back over to our code. We want to find the wish list create component. And if you remember, inside our component, we had this class called wish list create form. So let's go ahead and create a CSS class called wishlistCreateForm. So we're going to open up the wishlistCreate.component.css file. And we're going to say wish list, create form, and then we're just going to set the width to 60%. Let's go ahead and save it. Go back over to our browser window to make sure that the form has gotten smaller. And it looks like it has. It looks like it's only 60% now. And actually that looks fine for this demonstration. So let's go ahead and enter a title. So we'll say some new title, and then the authors will say Professor Crasso. And then we want to go ahead and select the Add Item button. And if you've been following along and all the code has been written as I have it in the screen, you should see the items being added to the bottom of our wish list component. So this top part here that you see, which is the two fields, is going to be the wish list create component, and then the values are being emitted to this bottom, which is actually the wish list component. So we'll just add a couple different entries here just to show that the array is populating and filling up with our wish list items. So we're going to say some new title again, and then we'll say Professor Crasso. We'll add the item, and it looks like it was added underneath there. We'll add another, some awesome new title from Professor Crasso, and we'll add it. Then we'll add just one more, so we'll say some really awesome new title and from Professor Crasso. So as you can see, what we're basically doing is we have two components. We have a create component, and then we have a wish list component. The wish list create component has a simple form field with two field values of title and authors. And when we submit the form, we're emitting those values back to the wish list component. So this is the very essence of how output properties work in an Angular application. To recap, in this lesson we covered the ng model, form submissions, mat form fields, and how to pass data between components using output properties. In our next lesson, we'll discuss base layouts, authentication and authorization layouts, and custom 404 pages. Thank you for watching.